To quote what is quite possibly the greatest deleted scene in American sitcom history, who doesn't love a good comeback story? Good morning, metalheads of the internet, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Metal Meltdown. Today we're doing something a little bit different. Today we're talking about some of the best metal comeback albums of all time. Excellent, amazing, career-reviving albums made by bands who disappeared for a bit, who stepped away from the spotlight for a bit, who maybe just now finally got their shit together after years of internal struggles. Maybe they just straight up sucked for a while, and they just finally put out something like actually good, and it put them back on the map to success. I have compiled a list of 10 albums that fit all of this criteria and also represent a decent variety of metal subgenres. So without further ado, let's get right into it. These are, in my opinion, the best metal comeback albums of all time. First up, we have Brave New World from Iron Maiden, released in May 2000 via EMI Records. 20 years later, this is still, frankly, a fantastic album, and it's one that brought the Iron Maiden that we know and love back to the forefront of rock and metal music. After a bunch of lineup changes and other flubs and mistakes that led to some pretty underwhelming albums, in my opinion, Iron Maiden really finally get their shit together on Brave New World. Bruce Dickinson rejoins the band, Adrian Smith rejoins the band, and they're back to writing epic, poignant, dynamic, stadium metal ragers and bangers with progressive shades and tones. Songs like The Wicker Man, The Ghost of the Navigator, Blood Brothers, Out of the Silent Planet, these honestly rank as some of Iron Maiden's best material, not just of this, quote, modern era, but maybe in Iron Maiden's entire catalog. And the whole thing just has like an authentically old school Iron Maiden feel and sound, you know? Like a cross between like what the band were doing on Peace of Mind and Power Slave with what they were doing on Somewhere in Time. In fact, if you told me this was released somewhere in that time span in which these albums occupy, or even shortly after, I honestly might believe you. Like if I didn't know any better, at least. And after 24 years, there are people who would not only argue that this is on par with classic material, but there are people who would genuinely argue, be willing to argue, that this is Iron Maiden's best album altogether. Next up, we have Monotheist from Celtic Frost, released in May 2006 via Century Media Records. It's been kind of rough for Celtic Frost between like 1988 and 2006, you know? Like, Celtic Frost releases Cold Lake. It gets absolutely fucking annihilated by critics and fans alike. You know, still regarded to this day as one of the worst fucking sleaze rock glam metal records ever made, from a band that had no business being a part of sleaze rock and glam metal to begin with. Vanity Nemesis comes out, and it's better, but I don't know, people still aren't really feeling it. Then Celtic Frost disbands in the early 90s, they get back together in the early 2000s, they do a couple of shows, and they very slowly and painfully work on this album behind the scenes until its release in 2006. And with all this in mind, there was a lot of reason, a lot of potential to believe that this thing could've, would've, maybe even should've sucked. But it did not. In fact, not only is Monotheist a great album, not only is it a great comeback album that cements everything awesome about Celtic Frost, but it's actually probably one of their most ambitious albums. And this is saying a lot, considering Celtic Frost, even at their worst, are a pretty ambitious band. It's just such a moody, demented, and depraved record with so many, like, rabid, almost unpredictable changes and switches. You know, one minute we're just wallowing in misery with these, like, heavy, smoky shades of, like, doom metal with, like, you know, just pure sadness and darkness draped over top of us. We're wearing it like a cape. And the next we're getting, like, battered over the head, you know? Motherfuckers screaming at us and blast beats and these incredibly heavy fucking riffs. Next up, we have The Formation of Damnation from Testament, released in April 2008 via Nuclear Blast Records. Now, Testament never really disbanded or disappeared, per se, in the 2000s. They just had other priorities for a while, namely Chuck Billy's health and safety. See, in 2001, Chuck Billy was diagnosed with germ cell seminoma. His was a rare medical situation since this type of cancer usually manifests in men's testicular region, while in Billy's case the tumor appeared in the chest region near his heart. Now, it is worth noting that in this time, Testament did release kind of a compilation album of sorts called First Strike Still Deadly. It's a bunch of songs that were released on previous studio albums that were re-recorded and rearranged and reproduced and such. And it's fine, I guess. I mean, I'm sure it has its fans. I'm not personally one of them, but, you know, whatevs. It's all good. This is the real comeback album here, though. The Formation of Damnation. After Chuck Billy is given a clean bill of health, Testament slowly spends the 2000s putting this bad boy together. In this time, Alex Skolnick and Greg Christian rejoin the band on guitar and bass, respectively. Paul Bastaf also officially joins Testament after kind of being like a live drummer, kind of performing with them off and on throughout the 90s and early 2000s. And all of them fucking lock in and release this absolute mad banger. To be honest, there are songs from this album that I rank among Testament's best, and I still have crammed pretty far in my head to this day. Next up, we have Colored Sands from Gorguts, released in August 2013 via Season of Mist. These guys might not be death metal icons in the same way that maybe Death or Cannibal Corpse are, but they are, nonetheless, death metal icons. Without them, there is so much that happens within the realms of technical death metal and avant-garde death metal and the Canadian death metal scene that just does not exist. Frankly, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of metal bands that owe their very existence to that of Obscura, one of the most technical and complex records ever made, with spiritual existentialist themes and all of these wild, erratic time changes and tempo changes and these strange riffs and these demented screaming vocals. It's an absolute fucking mindfuck in the best way possible. And 2001's From Risen to Hate did a great job at kind of like refining a lot of that madness into something that was insane but maybe more palatable. And unlike a lot of the bands we're talking about today, Gorguts didn't disappear because they disbanded and couldn't get their shit together. They didn't disappear because of some health or legal issues. They just straight up kind of disappeared because they did. Like, Luc Lemay was very slowly and meticulously working on this record for a long time. The dude's a fucking perfectionist and was not ready to release this until he felt it was 100% absolutely perfect. And in my opinion, he absolutely succeeded. I would argue this is a perfect record. I mean, I love how he plays around with so many different sounds and arrangements and tones. I love that it has these ambient sections and these more frenzied, technical, avant-garde death metal sections. I love the contrast that he's able to create. I love that he's expanding on these very spiritual, very existentialist themes. And now, much like before, Luc Lemay has locked himself away and is very slowly, very meticulously working on yet another Gorguts album. And you know what? The dude can take all the fucking time he wants at this point. I don't care. I could be on my deathbed and only within my final moments finally hear new Gorguts, and I'd be fucking satisfied. I'll know it'll be worth it. I just know it. I know. Next up, we have Surgical Steel, released in September 2013 via Nuclear Blast Records, and in my opinion, this isn't just one of the best comeback albums ever made, it is the best comeback album ever made. Holy shit. Masters and pioneers of multiple subgenres of extreme metal, including gore grind and melodic death metal, finally return after 17 years of silence, ending their career previously on the very divisive and controversial Swan Song. They came back roaring with an album that I define as just pure metal. Like, when you say metal music, just pure metal altogether. This is literally one of the first albums that comes to my mind. That super chunky, glistening guitar tone with that super metallic sheen. Those ferocious, acidic, gurgling vocals. All of the thrashy leads and dynamic twin guitar leads and bombastic extreme metal barrages. Pure metal. Pure fucking metal. Just a thoroughly excellent, addictive album combining the best elements, specifically of necroticism and heartwork. Even like the fucking B-sides and leftovers and unreleased cuts from this record are all fucking excellent as well. You can hear all of them on the Surgical Remission Surplus Steel EP, and it goes fucking hard. Next up, we have At War with Reality from At the Gates, released in October 2014 via Century Media Records. This would be the first album in 18 years from these Swedish melodic death metal icons and pioneers, and it's fucking excellent. It really doesn't feel as if any time passed whatsoever between this and their previous studio album, Slaughter of the Soul. Now, back in 96, At the Gates broke up because Anders and Jonas Björlin had already left the band, and they really didn't think they could go on without them, or at least they didn't want to bother trying to. They all kind of went their separate ways, got involved in other projects, and in some cases just actually had real, normal human lives. And then after a few reunion tours here and there in the late 2000s, and then after a few reunion tours here and there in the late 2000s and early 2010s, At the Gates finally decide, fuck it, let's get back together, let's really give it a shot, and it's fucking awesome. Like, there is some seriously carnivorish hype as fuck riffage on here. Songwriting and songcraft is fucking excellent. Thomas Lindberg sounding bloodthirsty on lead vocals consistently across this thing. I mean, the title tracks, Circular Ruins, Order from Chaos, Eater of Gods, Jesus Christ, they're just so fucking good. Next up, we have Revelations of Oblivion from Possessed, released in May 2019 via Nuclear Blast Records. We've talked a lot about death metal so far in this video. Carcass, Gorguts, At the Gates. But what about the true fathers of death metal? The band that paved the way for the entire death metal genre. Maybe not knowingly so, but nonetheless. What about Possessed? At this point, it shouldn't be surprising or controversial to say that without the 1984 death metal demo and without 1985's Seven Churches, death metal as a genre probably doesn't exist. But as death metal was really beginning to get established in the late 80s with bands like Death, Cannibal Corpse, and with some of the bands we've already mentioned thus far, Possessed kind of disappears. Now, part of this, I assume, is because Jeff Becerra, the band's singer and mastermind, was held hostage at gunpoint in 1989 and paralyzed from the waist down. I don't know, call me crazy, but it just kind of seems like, in 1989 and in the years following, Jeff had other things to worry about than Possessed. And this is why Revelations of Oblivion is also such a great comeback album, because nobody saw it coming. Like, fucking nobody. Like, I don't think anybody expected Jeff to really fucking put himself back out there and get back in the studio, reform Possessed, but he fucking did, and the album is fucking great. Next up, we have Wildhun from Lantlos, released in July 2021 via Prophecy Productions. There is a real argument to be made that, much like Possessed with death metal in the 80s, Lantlos are more musically instrumental and important to the development of black gaze than the likes of, say, Alcest and Death Heaven, who would be like the poster boys for the genre, the most popular. And that's no disrespect to Alcest and Death Heaven per se, because they are very important. They're great bands. They've made great music. But there is so much with what we identify as black gaze that comes specifically from what Lantlos was doing on records like Neon and Agape. Interestingly, though, 2014's Melting Sun shows Lantlos going in a much different direction, inspired by dreamy passages and melodies, and alternative metal and progressive metal. But it is an amazing fucking record, and it took a long time to get its follow-up, Wildhun, but it was absolutely worth the wait. So many amazing vocal textures and passages here, so many amazing transcendent arrangements and atmospheric parts, so many great riffs. I love that sludgy feel. I love some of the really technical bass work and some of the really technical rhythm guitar that often rides underneath everything. It's a very immersive and warm and consuming album. It just really feels like I'm walking through a dream, or like a wide open field with the sun gleaming on my face, but there's like a light, cool breeze and maybe a bit of rain. Next up, we have Death Album 4 from Dethklok, released in August 2023 via Water Tower Music. Now, this is interesting because, from what I can tell, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not an expert, and this is not something I've intensely paid attention to. But from what I can tell, Dethklok didn't disappear because they necessarily wanted to. It's not as if there were some behind-the-scenes issues and they weren't getting along and they were button heads, there were health issues or whatever the fuck. They disappeared because they literally, legally kind of had to. I'm not really sure of the specifics, but from what I can tell, there was some kind of dispute between Brendan Small, the creator of Dethklok, and also the mastermind of the Metalocalypse show and the Dethklok band, and also, like, Adult Swim and, you know, Warner Brothers and shit like that. Like, there were a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and they all had specific demands, and as a result, Dethklok and, you know, Metalocalypse and all that just kind of wasn't allowed to exist for a bit. But Dethklok officially came back after, I guess they figured things out. Last year, there was the Metalocalypse Army of the Doomstar movie, and obviously also Dethklok had a brand new album. They went out on tour with Baby Metal. They're about to go on tour again. It's unclear what the future of Dethklok and Metalocalypse is at this moment. Like, I don't even think Brendan Small really knows, or at least he wasn't really willing to share with me when we did our interview back in September. But I can tell you, this is a great comeback record, and, you know, it was great for Metalocalypse to finally come back strong, not only for us to get this final record from Dethklok, but to also finally finish off the story of Metalocalypse. This album has that really great sense of humor that I love from previous Dethklok records, even if it isn't quite as zany in some aspects. Some ferocious, fierce, crushing, very well written and produced, like, melodic death metal as well. This was just, like, an awesome thing to be a part of. Like, in the case of most of these albums, you know, I wasn't alive in, like, the 80s when Possessed dropped Seven Churches. I wasn't alive in the 90s when fucking Carcass dropped Heartwork. I was alive when At the Gates dropped Slaughter of the Soul, but I was one, you know? I was a fucking little babu baby. But, like, I grew up watching Metalocalypse. I remember watching it in, like, middle school and high school, staying up late to watch it on, like, Teletoon at night here in Canada, and, like, watching it on YouTube with friends at school the next day. And finally, we have Moon Healer from Job for a Cowboy, released this year, just last month, February 2024, via Metal Blade Records. I'm going to try to keep this kind of brief because we reviewed this again last fucking month. Just go look up the review. It's all fucking good. But I will say, since we're already here, like, Job for a Cowboy, in the 10-year time gap between this and Sun Eater, like, they were kind of sort of actively working on this album. Like, they had ideas and there was things going. But the main reason Job for a Cowboy disappeared, quote unquote, is they just kind of grew up, you know? They went to school, they got married, they had kids, they had mortgages. Playing death metal was no longer the focus of their lives, but they were able to slowly piece together this album over the course of a decade. They had ideas that they were slowly working on. They finally got their shit together, and they finally dropped Moon Healer, and it doesn't feel as if any time has passed at all. Immersive, deep, playful, colorful, technical, and progressive death metal with some wild, funky bass work, some really great lyrics about, like, all these psychedelic experiences and drugs and, like, these mind-altering, like, kind of moments. Don't let that goofy name Job for a Cowboy fool you, and don't let the fact that they were ever so briefly a deathcore band fool you either. This album kicks supreme amounts of ass. And voila! Those are, in my opinion, the best metal comeback albums of all time. Tell me, what are some great metal comeback albums that you love, that I maybe didn't talk about here today, that we should all just go listen to for shits and giggles and talk about here in the comments section? That would be a great thing to tell me about and let me know about. I guess, I don't know, your call. You can just fuck off or whatever if you like, but I don't know, since you're here, I don't know. I like talking to you. You're a cool guy, man. I like hanging out with you, you know, whatever. Press this button to subscribe. Look, there's even more videos here, and as always, you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.